Another major insight was that there's no Ukraine option for Taiwan. With Ukraine, of course, the United States and allies have sent munitions and weapons into Ukraine after the war began. The Russians have tried to interdict that flow, but have been unable to do that. That's not possible with Taiwan. The Chinese defensive bubble over Taiwan is so strong that you can't get anything in there for at least a month or two. In the games, we had several players who tried to do that. They tried to sail, for example, one of the Marine littoral regiments onto Taiwan. That convoy was always sunk. One team tried to fly some reinforcements onto the island. The C-17s were all shot down. So Taiwan has to start the war with everything it needs for at least the first month or two. Another major insight was the importance of munitions inventories. And these have been getting a lot of attention recently because of shortages as a result of the war in Ukraine and U.S. deliveries to Ukraine. Our war game also contributed to that discussion. We found that some major elements of U.S. missile capability, long-range anti-ship missiles, run out in the first couple of days. So the United States needs to expand those inventories. And the Pentagon's doing that, but it's going to take many years. An additional insight is how different a great power conflict will be from the experience of the last 25 years when the United States has fought counterinsurgencies and regional conflicts. The leadership in the Pentagon, the service chiefs, recognize how different it's going to be, and they've stated many times about demands of a great power conflict, and they're trying to reorient their force structures. The problem is that the lived experience of the mid-level officers who have been in these regional conflicts is very different from what we would experience in a great power conflict. I think this is particularly true for the Air Force and the Navy, which for the last 25 years at least have operated essentially in sanctuary. Adversaries have not been able to get at our fleet and not been able to get at our air bases. The example I use is follow-on forces that land at Kadena Air Force Base on Okinawa. These follow-on aircraft will land on a runway that's very bumpy because it has been patched so many times after Chinese missile attacks. They're going to taxi past literally hundreds of wrecked aircraft that were destroyed on the ground. They're going to move into a barracks that was vacated by the previous squadron because they were all killed in the previous missile attacks. The hospital is going to be full of wounded. The golf course will have been turned into a cemetery, and they will be told, welcome to Okinawa, tomorrow you fly over Taiwan. And that is an experience the Air Force has not had since arguably 1944.
Yeah, I think probably the fair statement is World War III that kicks off. You mentioned in the war game, or you war gamed as well. Can you talk to me about the civilian aspect of it? Because you alluded to there were scenarios where the Chinese would send a submarine off the West Coast targeting U.S. cities. Can you talk to the aspect of the civilian impact and how that might affect the scenario?
We wrestled a lot with Chinese capabilities and the notion of sending a submarine to the U.S. West Coast. We had some players who were very imaginative and hypothesized various kinds of cyber attacks, even special operations attacks on U.S. leadership. We finally decided to limit capabilities to demonstrated capabilities. That is, if the Chinese or the U.S. had shown the ability to conduct certain operations, then we put those in the game. If they had not, then we didn't. And we recognize that there's some risk of surprise, but otherwise people come up with all kinds of interesting possibilities that that either side would be really unable to do. So in this case, the Chinese submarines were mostly wrapped up with operations in the Western Pacific. And in fact, we see this across the board. That is, the conflict is so intense that neither side has a lot of capability to divert it to other goals. With the Chinese, of course, they're desperately trying to save their amphibious ships. With the United States, we're trying to attack the amphibious ships. And I would note that the amphibious ships, Chinese amphibious ships, are the center of gravity for the campaign. Some U.S. teams thought about conducting a deep attack on the Chinese mainland, strategic attack campaigns against infrastructure and political institutions, but they quickly found that they just didn't have enough capability to do that, which might have effect, but take weeks or arguably months, when the Chinese were landing troops on Taiwan and attacking U.S. forces. So the struggle around Taiwan really absorbs all of the military attention for both sides.
We did talk to it earlier, the 100 miles you have to cross. It's still 100 miles, not an easy thing to do. When it comes to assumptions of capabilities of the Chinese being able to cross the Taiwan Strait in large numbers, how did that fit into the war games?
For all military forces, we assumed as the base case that they could execute the missions for which they were designed. So for the Chinese, that meant that they could use their amphibious capabilities for which they had built ships. Same for the Taiwanese and the Japanese, as well as the United States. Even with those capabilities, which were quite robust, and that assumed that the very high level of Chinese capability for joint operations and amphibious operations, even then they struggled to get forces ashore and then sustain them. Logistics turned out to be a huge problem. We ran some excursions where the Chinese were not as skilled in joint operations and amphibious operations, and in those situations they lost very quickly because, of course, the whole campaign focuses on their ability to do both of those.
I would like to segue, because you've written about Ukraine, you've written about Israel, but to segue between the two, with the wargaming in the report, you do talk about parallels between Ukraine and China and Taiwan. Can you talk about what those parallels are and what are not paralleled?
There are a few important parallels. I think the big one is bad things happen. Before the invasion of Ukraine, most commentators, myself included, just couldn't believe that a country in the 21st century would invade a neighboring country and then try to conquer it. But in fact, that's what the Russians did. Some years ago, I wrote a report on what I called coping with surprise. And one of the points I made was that bad things happen. Unexpected things happen. Countries will weigh military decisions in a way that we think are unwise or misplaced, but they will do that anyway. Maybe their assumptions about military capability are different from ours. Maybe their assumptions about changing military balance is different from ours, and they feel that they have to move now. But for whatever reason, surprises, attacks happen. Of course, one of the classic examples there is Japan attacking the United States in 1941. The United States had done its analysis and thought that this was be a very foolish thing for the Japanese to do. And we were right. But they did it anyway. And the Japanese had done the same analysis. They weren't under a lot of illusions about their ability to defeat the United States. They intended to strike the United States hard enough that we got discouraged, but they recognized the risks also, but decided that the risks were worthwhile given the squeeze that was being put on the Japanese economy. So if I had to pick one major insight that comes out of Ukraine is bad things happen. And if the Chinese were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, no one would get up and say, wow, didn't see that coming. No, everybody would say, oh yeah, we've been expecting that for a long time. So it's important then to be ready for that kind of situation.